Okay, awesome. Good evening, everybody. I'm Pam with the UVA Club of Charlottesville, and we're so happy everyone is joining us tonight. This is bread making with the baker, Brennan Schmidt, and Sarah Elizabeth Schmidt, who is his wife. And as you may have read already, when you signed up, Brennan is, I think he's a triple who, if I did that correctly. I don't know.
Double. We're two doubles between us.
Okay, got it. All right. So
the competition to see who's going to get that third one first.
You get the third one. All right. So Brennan was a student athlete when he was at UVA. He served as a defensive line and team captain for the Cavalier football team. Go Hoos! And then returned to coach while he was completing a graduate degree at Curry. So I've talked to Brennan several times about bread making, and it's really a lot more complicated than I realized. So he has been perfecting his craft, I think, for about 6 years, and then started Wholly Schmidt in February. And we're just thrilled that he's going to join us. And that's all I have. I think we're ready to go.
Awesome. Well, once again, Pam, thank you so much. And thank you to the UVA Club of Charlottesville. If you haven't guessed yet, I'm one half of Wholly Schmidt Sourdough. I'm Sarah Elizabeth, and I am neither the brains nor the beauty nor the baker. Actually, I just get to support and tee up all of those things in my husband. And you might notice that we are on two different screens in seemingly two different areas. And that is because we're in the same house, but we do have two small, hopefully future Wahoos, like class of 2037 and 39, I think. And so I'm gonna be hopefully running some interference for him to make sure that they do not interrupt this session. And then also so that he can focus on the actual bread making. I'll be keeping an eye on chat. So if you have questions as we go along, feel free to drop them in there and I will relay them to him at certain points during the session. So once again, we just want to say thank you so much for having us. We are looking forward to this session, and it's just great to see so many faces, both that we recognize, but also new faces. So thank you again. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the baker himself, Mr. Brennan Schmidt.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, I am so thrilled you guys can join me tonight to learn some basics about making sourdough bread. It is both a fun and frustrating task, and one that I have grown to love. And I hope to tonight give you some basics and a foundation so that you can get your foot, so you can get started on the right path and not be as frustrated as I was in the beginning with just a few principles and techniques to focus on. Sourdough bread can be really difficult because it's not like the way we're used to baking. In modern baking, we're used to following very specific recipes and amounts to get a very specific result. But in sourdough bread, which has been going on for thousands of years, I mean, let that sink in for a second, that people have been making this bread this way since the beginning of civilization. And they didn't have a rule book, they didn't have fancy equipment or anything like that. And they were able to do it. And so that should give us some hope that if we just take down comprehend just a few simple principles and techniques, that we'll be able to do it ourselves. But you got to have a little gumption. You can't think that you're going to do this perfect in the first try. It's a craft. And that's actually one of the things I love about it, is that it's constantly challenging me and humbling me, which makes me grow. And so that's why I love sourdough. I first drew into it for the health aspect. And now I can't stay away from the taste. I mean, it is just so delicious and nutritious. But there are tons of reasons, for health reasons, to bake your own sourdough bread and to eat sourdough bread. And sourdough bread is not the only thing you can make with these techniques I'm going to show you. You can make pizza, waffles, buns, English muffins. We run the gamut in our house, and it makes some of those really delicious meals that you normally have a little bit of guilt about, because you're saying, how much gluten is in this, and what's this going to do to my waistline? But with sourdough bread, it really is good for your gut. And so you can turn some meals that you normally have a little bit of guilt about into something that's really delicious and great. So without further ado, I'm going to dive right in. Hopefully you have your equipment and some of the things I sent you in that email ready to go. Follow along as best as you can. I have things staged out, so just focus and keep your notepad going for the different places where I show some emphasis. And those are the places that you'll need to practice over and over again, because it's not going to turn out perfectly the first time, I promise you. But it will be a delicious mistake if that makes you feel any better. And all the mistakes in sourdough are delicious, so that's the fun of it. The foundation I'm gonna build for you today is gonna be built on some principles and techniques. There's three principles that I want to start you on, and that's with hydration, temperature, and whole grain. So those three things are really what affects the rate of fermentation that goes on in your sourdough. Okay, those are three variables that I isolate. So just like the scientific method, don't change three things at a time, change one thing at a time. And so tonight we're just gonna focus on temperature. If you follow the recipe I've given you, I've controlled for how much whole grain is in it. And if you also follow the recipe, you'll also see how much water is in it. Those are normally things I experiment with all the time, and you can too. But tonight, let's not do that. Let's focus on just temperature. Techniques. So if you have made bread before, you are used to kneading dough and being very aggressive with the dough. But with these techniques, they are very gentle with the dough. So it's a different process that develops the gluten over time so that you can get those nice big bubbles inside of your bread and have a nice fluffy, light crumb. And the crumb, if you're wondering, is the inside of the bread. The crust is the outside, the crumb is the middle, to give you some baker terminology. So let's begin. If you followed the schedule that I gave you for your starter, then you should be ready to go. I'm going to take out the starter. You can take out yours as well. Take a look at it. I'm going to take out a few other tools as well. Take a look at your starter. Now, last night I told you about the line you draw on your starter. That's to give you that starting point for the bell curve that it follows in its life cycle. Right now, you can see that it's about double the size from its original size. So that means we're good to go. But there's a way that we can test this. And grab your bowl and grab some water. We're going to do our first technique, which is called the float test. Now, first emphasis on temperature is on the temperature of your water. If you have a thermometer, that is great, but if you don't worry about it. I've gone a long time without using a thermometer and been just fine, but it helps to be exact. The temperature of my water is 85 degrees, and that's about as high as you want to go. So between 75 degrees and 85 degrees is that happy spot for fermentation. And the lower the temperature of the water, the lower the temperature of the dough, the longer this folding process is going to take. And making sourdough is long enough. We want to shorten some of it so that it doesn't destroy our entire lives, and that we can still have delicious bread without spending an entire day watching dough rise. So to find 85 degrees, it's going to be above cool. It's not going to be hot. It's going to be right in that warm region. Just use your finger to test it out. But you want it a little warm, not very warm, but a little warm. I know that's hard to gauge, but over time you'll start to figure it out. What you're going to do is we're going to start a recipe by pouring in the amount of water we need. I'm gonna measure. I'll give you both the measurements in volume and in weight, if you're following along. If you're doing things by a scale, it's pretty simple and straightforward. With your measuring cups, just do the best you can. It's not about being exact. I promise you, and that's a tough thing for a lot of bakers. But promise me, you'll feel a lot freer in this process if you're not worrying about exact measurements. So for our water, we're going to start off with 375 grams, which is going to be 1.5 cups. So go ahead and take your 1/2 cup and dish it in there 3 times. All right. Now we're going to do the float test, which is a test to see how much carbon dioxide has built up in your starter. So if there hasn't been enough carbon dioxide, it hasn't been developed enough. But if it does pass the float test, it's ready to go. So let's see where we're at. I'm going to take just a little bit of starter, and I'm just going to peel it off into my water. Now, you may or may not be able to see that, but my starter is floating on the top.
Hey, Brennan, sorry to interrupt. How much water did you say? 1/4 cups?
1.5 cups.
1.5 cups.
Yes, thank you. So we have 1.5 cups or 375 grams if you're measuring by weight. Now, since we know our starter is ready to go, well, here's another point before I move on. Taste your starter. Dip your finger in there. See how it tastes. Assess how much acidity is in it. This is going to really affect the taste of your bread. If you like really sour bread, let your sourdough starter go a little bit far on the bell curve so that it carries that acidity into your bread. If you like a more sweet bread, then taste it along the way, and once it reaches that certain acidity that you like, then start to mix it into your bread. So this is a key point as far as flavor, as far as what outcome you're going for.
Does anyone need to be worried about, quote unquote, like eating something raw as they're tasting this?
No, because these are grains. There's no meat. You don't have to worry about all the bacteria and yeast that is in this is really good for your gut. So I give it to my kids a lot. They love it.
If someone's starter sank, does it need to sit a little bit longer?
At this point, just go for it. It'll be fine. It's not at its ideal point, but it'll make good bread either way. So just go for it. All right, so I've measured out 1/3 cup of starter. Go ahead and pour that into your water. And that 1/3 cup of starter is about 60 grams. Is about 60 grams if you're measuring. Now you may not be able to see this, but the starter is floating on the top. Go ahead and take your fingers and disperse it in the water so it's all evenly dispersed.
The UVA class ring has such a beautiful glint as you're stirring, honey.
Oh, thank you. So now we have what we call liquid starter because it's just very liquidy, to put it simply. Now take out the flour that you have prepared. And let's add our flour. We're not going to add our salt yet, so put that to the side. In the recipe I gave you, we're going to do 25% whole grain and 75% white flour. That can be any kind of white flour that you like. The whole grain, again, any kind of whole grain that you like as well. Whole grain is, I'll pause for a second here and talk about whole grain. Whole grain is both a gift and a curse when it comes to bread. The more whole grain that you have in your sourdough, the healthier it is, because your sourdough starter loves the complete package when it comes to a grain. The shell, the germ, And that's what the whole grain flour is. It's a whole piece. However, that shell of the grain has a very sharp side to it. And so those gluten strands, which are creating that matrix that make it rise, get sliced through. And so that's why you see that more whole grain bread is not big and fluffy, but it's easier to digest. So it's a trade-off of what you're going for.
Brennan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we've had a couple of people say they weren't able to find whole grains. So should they just use all the white regular flour?
Yeah, just go straight all white flour for this. So for our whole grain, we're going to do a cup, which is 125 grams approximately. So 1 cup of whole grain, and then 3 cups of white flour. Okay, don't pack it in, keep it loose. And there you go. You can put away your flour now. We're going to start mixing. Now, this sounds funny, but mixing with your hand has some advantages. It's hard to notice sometimes, but the science is out there about the yeast on your hands actually can help increase fermentation. So mixing with your hand or wooden spoon, which have yeasts on them to begin with, can increase the fermentation that's going on in your bread. In fact, when you are creating a starter from scratch, it's a really good idea to mix with your hand so that those yeasts that are from your skin can start to inoculate your starter. It's going to feel really dry at first. So just keep pressing it and turning it until all the water is soaked up. Now I can tell that this is a little bit dry. So I'm going to add just a little bit more water. I mean, I probably am adding probably a tablespoon here. And that's what you have to do when you are measuring with cups, by volume and not by weight. You have to be a little bit more observant. The scale takes a lot of the guesswork out, which is nice. And when I'm making huge batches of dough, I really need that. But when you're learning and experimenting with what the dough feels like, go ahead and observe it and see if it needs water, if it's too dry. In the beginning, it's going to feel pretty dry though, because the grains need time to absorb the water. And that period is called the autolyse or autolyse. It's that period between mixing it all together and putting salt in that the grains are allowed to absorb a lot of the water.
What was the quantity of whole wheat flour, Brennan?
It was 125 grams or 1 cup approximately.
1 cup, okay.
And 3 cups white flour.
And if you don't have any of the whole grain, then 4 cups white flour. Great.
That's just this. All right, let me wash my hands real quick.
It's so fun seeing everyone doing this in their own kitchens.
That's great. So after that's mixed together, and again, until there's no dry bits, go ahead and really work it in there. Go ahead and cover it. And you're going to set it in a warm place. Again, we're going to focus on, here's another place to think about temperature. So we mixed warm water into our dough, but now we also need to keep the temperature nice at that warm stage. So if you have a warm place in your kitchen, great, put it there. If you don't, use your oven. And that sounds funny. You're not going to cook the dough. All you're going to do is turn the light on in your oven and close the door. The light is going to generate just a little bit of heat in there and create an ambient temperature of between 80 and 90 degrees. And so that's going to be a nice warm place for your dough to start to ferment. So go ahead and put that in the oven. I'm just going to set it to the side. I've taken a few different doughs at different stages so that I can show you what to look for next. All right, so now let's talk about the schedule from mixing, which we call the folding schedule. Right now we're gonna we just mix the dough, and there's a stage called folding, and then at the end of that we're gonna shape it. This folding stage is where we're gonna develop the dough. So I mixed some dough before we started, and that same dough, you probably can't see it very well, but that dough is looking a lot more hydrated than it was before. And so that's what you're gonna see after about 30 minutes. This next stage is gonna be in 30-minute intervals, okay? Remember that, 30-minute intervals. So we just mixed, we're gonna set a clock for 30 minutes. Now we're gonna put in some salt and a little bit more water.
Brennan, before you do that, for the starter that people didn't use, they can just discard it or eat it, right?
Yeah, you can discard it. We put it in our compost, or you can make different things from it. There's recipes that use starter discard, whether it's making pancakes or waffles or crepes, are some of our favorites. But there's other ways you can use your starter so it doesn't go completely to waste. Good question. Now we're gonna add the salt. We finished the autolyse, and so the grains are hydrated now. And the salt is actually going to, you can't eat bread without salt. I mean, it just tastes terrible. So we need salt, but the salt is also gonna slow down the fermentation a little bit. So with that period without salt, it's allowing the fermentation to get a kickstart, okay? Now we're gonna add the salt, and we're gonna add a little over between 2 and 3%, which is 12.5 grams if you're weighing it, or around 2 teaspoons. Don't be obsessed with being exact here. I've experimented with 3% salt, 1% salt. 1% is too low, by the way. You want at least 2%. But again, don't be obsessed with being exact. It doesn't make a huge difference. I have 2 teaspoons of salt in here. Now I'm going to add just a little bit of water so that the salt can dissolve. So let's grab the water, and I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of water. Grab my tablespoon. So you save, in your overall calculation of your dough, you're going to save a little bit of water for this step. After the water is poured on there, what you're going to do now is pinch it in. Now, here's another trick with sticky dough. Wet your hands before you stick it in. This will make it a lot less sticky on your hands. So.
Brennan, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to jump back in and remind people, we said it once, but this is like a start to finish hours long process. And so we are kind of like speeding up and almost doing like a time lapse. And so each step that Brennan talked about is like 30 minutes and then 30 minutes and then 30 minutes. So as we're going along, if you could just, as in between those steps, remind people like, and about an hour later, that's when this is going to happen.
That's a really good point. So it's been about 30 minutes from our first step to this step.
Sorry, we weren't more clear about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. So in this step, you're going to just lightly push your fingers through the dough so that the salty water can start to seep through. And if your hands ever get sticky, just dip them right back in the water. And now I want you to focus on this technique of folding. So let me get a little closer. Folding is basically what we're doing instead of kneading. You're going to fold, you're going to lift up your dough and fold it over halfway, turn the dough a quarter turn, and continue until you're all the way around. So it's going to be 4 folds on each side, okay? I'll show you what it looks like. You're going to reach underneath the dough, And you don't want to tear the dough. We're trying to keep that matrix together as much as possible. We want to stretch it without tearing and then fold it over. So go ahead and stretch it just like that and then fold it over. Quarter turn, stretch and fold. Stretch and fold. Stretch and fold. That's all you have to do. Cover it back up and put it back in its warm spot in the oven. Rinse your hands.
How much do you fold it, Brennan? Like how many quarter turns, all of that? Like how do I know when I'm done folding?
You're done folding after 4 turns.
Okay, so just one
Yeah.
rotation.
So one time around, 4 quarter turns, and you're going to continue folding it every 30 minutes for the next for 6 consecutive folds. So you're going to have 6 total folds. We just did 2. We mixed it, we folded it, and now we're going to do 4 more folds over that course of time with 30 minutes in between each time. The reason is because you are basically developing the gluten gently over time so that those bubbles can start to form. And it takes time for each time you stretch and fold for the gluten to resettle and relax. And so that's what you're going to see each time, is that with every fold, it's going to start to get a little bit more firm and rounded. And so your gluten is going to be starting to strengthen up. And that's the technique. That's an important technique. The things that you really want to focus on are not tearing the dough and just stretching it. Okay? Using 2 hands, 2 wet hands is great.
And so one more time, the total amount of folds that we're going to do is 4 or 6?
So good question. So in each fold, you do it 4 times, but over the course, you're going to do it for 3 hours in 30
6
minutes.
times. Perfect.
6
So
times.
I know that what Brennan is showing you all now is further along the path than you would be with your bread kit that we set you up with. So at this point, feel free, your mix should be in the oven, being warm. Feel free to just like follow along, maybe have your favorite beverage and continue to ask questions as we go. We're getting a lot of action in the chat, so I apologize for popping in, but these are good questions.
Yeah, no, thank you. You should set a timer. So we're at about 20 to 25 minutes from our first mix. So when that timer goes off, do your first fold, okay? So I'm going to speed time up again and put away a few things. And I have a dough that I've been shaping, that I've been folding for a little while. I'm gonna do one more, which you'll see here. I don't know if you can see it very well in the light, but you'll start to see some bubbles that start to pop up. That's a good sign. That means that the fermentation is going on. And also another thing that I like to do is draw a line, just like on my starter. I draw a line where the dough is started so that I can see where in the bell curve that it's falling. Because just like your starter, your dough is going to rise and fall on the bell curve. And so as it's starting to rise, this dough right here is just a little bit above my original line. That's telling me it's this around this stage of the process, okay? By the time we get to the top, that's where we're gonna bake it, but it's gonna take a while to get there.
How do you know when it reaches the top of the curve? Like how much distance should there be from the line to the top?
Very good question. Then we're gonna use that technique we learned before, which is the float test. So I'm gonna test this dough to see if it's far enough along. And the way I'm gonna do that is same way as we did with the starter. I'm just gonna pinch off, and you don't wanna pinch it so that gas leaves it. You wanna try to squeeze it off at the bottom, a nice ball, so it still has its gas in it. and we're gonna see if it floats. Oh, it floated to the bottom, which means that it doesn't have quite enough carbon dioxide built up in it yet. So what I'll do is just do another stretch and fold.
In that stretch and fold, might I ask you a question, Chef, from Amalia, because I don't know the answer to this.
Yeah.
Amalia asked, do we refeed the starter to keep for next time? And how long after feeding before should we place in the fridge if it'll be a few days or a week before we bake again? Like, say if you're going out of town on vacation or something.
Yeah, 7 days is how long it'll last in the fridge after feeding it. So if you're gonna take a longer vacation, 7 days, you can do a few things. You can make it a little bit drier and decrease the amount of water in it, which will extend it, you know, a few more days, get you to 10. But if you're going out of town for a long time, you may want to ask someone to babysit it. That's what some people do, is have their sourdough starter babysit while they're gone, which I think is great.
But your core starter you can keep alive for years, right? Like your Lady Gaga, it's like a family pet at this point.
Yeah, Lady Gaga now has a voice, and kids love feeding Lady Gaga because they get to eat the sourdough that I don't use, the discard. But yeah, I've kept Lady Gaga alive for 6 years, and it's also easy to start one from scratch. So if yours ever dies, worry not. It's really simple to make a new one. So let's fast forward to about 3 hours later, where our dough has developed some strength. We've done about 5 to 6 turns. And again, observation here is key. When I was first starting out, I wanted to know exactly what to do so I could get the exact results. But what's humbling and actually kind of fun is that you have to use a lot of your senses in sourdough. You have to use your taste. You have to use your eyes. You have to see how much gas is in it. And so don't rely strictly on some steps. Use your observational skills. So here we're going to pinch off a little more. And it's not floating yet, but we still got to use it. And so we're going to move forward. But normally I would wait until my dough was floating in some water and passing the float test before I went on to shaping, okay? And that's what we're going to start now. So just to recap, we've mixed it. We've folded it over 3 hours in 30-minute intervals. And now let's pretend that it passed the float test. And now we're ready to shape the dough because now it's gathered enough carbon dioxide inside and it's nice and fluffy and billowy, okay? So to shape the dough, I'll bring out a few more tools. To shape the dough, what you're gonna do is wet your hands. Which is one of the best tricks I could teach you tonight as far as dealing with sticky dough, is wetting your hands and just peel that dough out of the tub onto your surface, okay? It may be sticky, it may be not. It'll feel different just about every time. I'm constantly surprised by sourdough bread, which is both frustrating and fun. What we're gonna do now is we're going to pre-shape the dough. But if you have one of these, this is great, a great tool. It's called a bench scraper. But if you don't, you can also use a spatula. Go ahead and wet that spatula so it's not sticking to the dough as much as well. And what you're gonna do is some shaping techniques, okay? Keep your hands nice and wet. You're going to cup the dough and stick the scraper underneath it so that it pulls underneath itself. Then you're going to rotate it and do the exact same thing. Keep rotating and spinning. What we're doing here is we're creating a nice tight skin. And this is slipping a bit on me. So I'm going to pull out my surface is a little wet here. So I'm just going to get my little bit drier area so you can see this better. So if you don't have a scraper, this is it. You can also just use your hands. You're going to stick your hands, keep them nice and wet, in front of the dough, and you're just going to pull that dough towards you. And you'll notice that the front side will start to roll up underneath itself. Turn the dough one more time and pull it towards you. And as it catches the ground, it's going to start to create a ball shape. Keep rotating it and doing that same technique. Until you have a general round shape. This is called the pre-shape. And what we're going to do is let this sit for about another 20 minutes. Because remember, throughout this process, we've manipulated the gluten, but then we've also let it relax so that it doesn't tear. And so with each step, we want to be gentle with the gluten. But we're going to fast forward a little bit. And after 20 minutes of this sitting and resting, we're going to begin to shape it. But before we do that, let's get a few tools ready that'll make, as we get prepared to shape this up. Let me wipe down my surface real quick. So we are going to shape this into a boule, which is a French term for just a round shape. And if you have a bowl, get that ready right now. If you have a towel, this is place it inside of the bowl because we're going to put the boule in here when we're done to rest. And that's pretty much, so we're pretty much ready to go to shape. All you're going to do now is take some flour. You have some flour ready? Go ahead and dust the top of your bread. And notice we haven't pulled out the flour until now. That's because we want a nice clean surface for the dough to be worked on. Dust the top of your dough so it's nice and floury, and then go ahead and flip it onto that floury side. Okay? Now, this shaping is pretty simple. And the best way this will be a frustrating time, so just prepare yourself that shaping it is not, it takes practice, like a lot of these techniques. But the way I like to think about shaping is creating a letter. So if your shape was square, which is not, you're going to create a fold from the bottom, a fold from the side, like that, another fold from the side, and then you're going to fold the top over, like that. And while my analogy doesn't quite fit this piece of paper, you're going to create almost the shape of the back of a letter. Not a letter, but an envelope. Forgive me, I didn't mean letter, I meant envelope. So you're creating the back of an envelope. The bottom up, sides over, and top down. Let me demonstrate. And I'll do this 2 times because this is probably the most technically difficult part of the bread making process. Let's see, my dough is sticking a little bit right now. So I'm just gonna flip it over and redust it. Okay. So I'm going to take this, spread it out a little bit. Take that bottom part, stretch it just a little bit. Again, don't tear, but stretch and flip it like that. Let's see if I can get this a little closer so you guys can see. Take the sides, fan it out. Again, stretching, but not tearing. one side over, the other side over. And now you can start to see this kind of looks like an envelope, all right, with like an open envelope. Now I'm going to take that top side, stretch it a little bit, and flip it over. And now it's a closed envelope. Now reach your hands on the back side of the envelope and fold it over itself. Now it's going to be, you'll see it has a rounded side on both sides. You can see that. And now for the last move in this technique, you're going to take your scraper or your hand. Let's use your hand since some people don't have scrapers. You can flour your hands if you need to. And you're going to do that same technique we talked about before, where you're going to cup your hands in front of the dough and pull it towards you. Rotate it, cup, and pull. Rotate it, cup, and pull. Rotate it, cup, and pull. Until it becomes a nice, tight, round ball. If you have a scraper, this can be a place where you can start to scrape the dough underneath, and it creates that tension on the top. And again, push it from all sides so it starts to roll up underneath itself and create that top surface tension, which you need for it to hold together. So that's pretty much it for shaping. Let's set that one aside. I'm gonna do that one more time for you guys, because like I said, this is where a lot of people get lost. So let me dip my hands in some water, the sticky dough.
And as Pam pointed out in the chat, we are recording tonight's session and we will make the link available to everyone. And for those of you who are tuning in but who didn't do the ticketed option where you got kind of the starter kit and these instructions beforehand, I've also dropped the instructions that we used into the chat as a PDF. And we'd be happy to send that out via email with the link to the recording after we finish this. You can come back and reference it and all that good sort of stuff.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, and Bren, I think people's timers went off, so it's been their first 30 minutes. Now this is the first time they do their stretch and fold quarter turn. Stretch, fold, quarter turn.
Yeah.
4 times for one 360 rotation, full rotation.
Correct, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
You can teach this class.
No, I'm like fumbling along. I'm not the baker, but I don't need to be. Evenly yoked.
That's right. So if you're doing those stretch and folds, nice and taut, nice and stretchy with no tearing, and folding it over itself, all the way over. All right, I'll do that shaping one more time, just because it's really helpful to see it from all different angles. I'll even try to do it from this angle. Dust the top of your dough, flip it over, fan it out a little bit, bottom halfway, see that? Fan out the sides, 1, 2, so they're crossed over top of each other. Now you have that open envelope look facing you. Then reach your fingers underneath, stretch, and close the envelope. Now, if your hands are sticky, grab some flour on them. Reach underneath the envelope, and then fold that envelope in half. Okay, see that? And then rotate it on top of that seam. Now is when you're gonna take, now all I'm gonna do is that same technique we did in pre-shape, which is just putting my hands in front of the dough, make sure it's not sticky, so flour your hands up, and start to pull that dough towards you. And it's gonna start to roll up underneath itself, creating that top surface tension. Just keep rotating and doing that. And again, you want to use your best judgment for not tearing and just stretching. Stretching, not tearing. Now it's shaped. This is a shaped boule. Let it sit here for just a little bit, maybe a minute or two, which is going to allow that to rest again and congeal that bottom. I'll take the one we did a second ago, and you're going to put it in the basket. Let me take this back over
And
here.
Bren, for this first stretch fold that people are doing, there's no additional salt, correct?
Correct. No additional salt.
No additional salt. And I think that's it, actually it for now.
Okay.
We have several doughs we are working with, again, at different stages so that we can show you all the different stages.
Correct. Yes. Focus on the techniques, and that'll steer you right. So now our dough is shaped. Now we need to put it in the basket so that it can proof. And that word proof is just it's proving that it's actually fermenting and rising. And that's where that term comes from. It's going to proof in your basket overnight or in the fridge. And I'll explain that in a second. Let me just put it in the basket first. So go ahead and give your dough a healthy dose of flour now. Even dust your basket where your towel is. And that's so it won't stick when you try to release it. Now, if you have a scraper, go ahead and just scrape it up and put it in your hand. If you don't, just go ahead and do that technique where it starts to release from the bottom. Now, notice how I flipped it over. So this is where it was sitting. I flipped it over to that floury side, and I'm going to set it in the basket. Okay? And now it's ready to go. It's ready to go for its long cold ferment. So we've been speeding up fermentation in this beginning part, trying to get it to a point where it's have enough gas and we can shape it and get it to a point where it can start to proof. Now we're going to slow it down by sticking it in the fridge. And the reason we do that is because the slower we make fermentation, the more the bacteria and yeast can turn those starches into sugars. And to laymen, that just means better flavor, okay? So we speed up the process, then we slow it down in the fridge. And this is a good time to, after you shape it tonight, stick it in the fridge and bake it first thing in the morning. So again, we're gonna speed things up. How are we doing on time?
Time check, 9 minutes.
Okay, all right, we're doing good. So when you put this in the fridge, you can do a few things to cover it because it's gonna be evaporating if you don't cover it. You can take a towel and stick it over top. That works. You can take some plastic wrap, wrap it up, maybe poke one or two holes in it so that it has a little bit of room to breathe. Or one of my favorite tools is hairnets. These things, you'll find great uses of these after you use them one time. We use them to wrap up plates of food after dinner, and you can reuse them, which is great, saves plastic. So after it's covered up, you're gonna stick it in the fridge and overnight, okay? In the morning, when you're ready to bake, or in the afternoon, but don't, again, use your observation skills. See how much it has risen. If it reaches too far on the other side of that bell curve, if it raises too much, then it's gonna lose that momentum into the bake. We wanna catch, just like in the starter, we wanna catch this right around the peak so that when we bake it, it blows up even more, uses that momentum. But if we let this ferment in the fridge too long and we bake it on this side, it's gonna start to fall and actually won't puff up. It'll actually fall and it won't create a crumb. It won't create that nice crumb inside. So
Do we use the float test to assess that?
no, at this point you can't use the float test anymore.
Oh yeah, duh.
You just have to use your observation as far as how much, because just like your starter, it's gonna double in size. By the time it reaches the peak of the bell curve, it's about double its size. So see how big it's grown in the fridge overnight. And so that's a good key that I always look for. So we're gonna speed ahead again. It's been in the fridge overnight. It's slowed down fermentation, but it's still creating really delicious flavor by doing that. And now it's the morning and it's time to bake. So let me get this guy out of the way. Take your cooking vessel. Let me get this out of the way. So your cooking vessel, there's a couple different choices you have here. This is a cast iron Dutch oven, and it holds heat well. You can heat it up to 500 degrees, and it's very durable. And most importantly, has a lid. You can also use a Pyrex bowl, which is what we mixed our dough in. These, sometimes you have a plastic lid. It's not a plastic lid, a glass lid that goes with these, and you can use that as your Dutch oven. Some people use their baking stone and put a pot or a Pyrex bowl over top. The key here is that the first half of your bake needs to have the moisture in the pot. Professional bakers use really high-tech equipment to inject steam. What's really cool for us is that we don't need any of that. We can just have a pot and it'll do all that same work and create the exact same professional results. In fact, I have about 4 of these and 6 other clay pots that do this exact same thing, which is really encouraging that you can achieve really good results with your bread just in your home kitchen. So, preheating your oven. Stick this in with the top on and preheat your oven to 500 degrees or 550 degrees if it goes that high for 45 minutes to an hour. You want to put this guy about in the middle shelf. You don't want to have it too close to your burner because then it'll start to burn your bread a little bit. So around the middle to upper part of your oven will work good, okay? It's been in there for an hour. It's super hot. It's ready to go. Time to take out your bread from the fridge. And now, take my best friend, parchment paper. This makes things a lot easier to handle when it comes to a hot pot and some dough that is ready to escape out of your hands. So, the things that I really like to do in this process is oil up my parchment paper. This is going to keep the parchment paper from sticking to your wet bread because it will do that. So give it a light oil across your parchment paper. Uncover your dough. And now stick that over top of it. All right, with your hand on top. Then you're just going to flip it over and peel off your towel. Okay, now to do some fun stuff. So scoring is a really fun and artistic way to make your bread both art and food. And this is one of the things that really got me hooked on baking sourdough are the fun and creative designs you can create on your bread with just a knife. One of the things that I will do is take a pencil, take anything you want, and, oh, sorry, before I get to there, we're gonna dust it first. So take some flour, and I'm using a sieve here to create a nice light dusting across the top. All right, then just smooth it out so that it still has a nice light coating of flour on the top. Then you can take your pencil, whatever you want to mark it up, and you're just gonna lightly create some designs. I like to create the grain designs by taking one straight line and then creating those grain leaves stemming from it. It's very beautiful, and it works really well with dough. What you'll start to see, though, is that there's a healthy amount of scoring and there's an unhealthy amount of scoring. So you can overdo it, you can underdo it, and you'll find out each time, which is always fun. So there's no real tricks I can tell you there other than to experiment and see what works. This is a lame. This is a very cheap tool, and it uses a fresh, sharp razor blade that it's curved. This can be a really fun tool for marking up your loaves. You can also use a knife or some scissors. It's going to create a similar effect, but it's creating the place in which the dough is going to open up. So for this design, I'm going to just lightly create some very shallow cuts into the dough that mimic those drawings I just made.
And Brennan, as you're doing that, we had a follow-up question about the number of times you should be feeding your starter for each bake.
That's a very good question. There is not one right answer there. The good starting place for that is on the days you're not baking, once a day. On the days you are baking, twice a day. But having said that, like today, I had you guys feed your starter in the morning and then at noon. And it's because we were building on that momentum that the starter was creating. So it rose in about 4 or 5 hours to its peak, and we fed it again. So we didn't wait 12 hours or 8 hours, however long we waited until it was at its peak so that we could continue that momentum into the next feeding. And that momentum is what you want going into your dough, is that a vigorous, strong starter. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. And just so everyone knows, it is 6:30, which is when we said we would wrap. We're happy to stay on so that Chef can finish taking you through the most fun part of this process. And again, we are recording the session. So if you need to hop or you're suffering from Zoom fatigue, which is real, we'll make sure to get you the link and the instructions. And thanks for your time. Brennan, I'll turn it back to you to finish scoring.
Thank you. Just a few more things to remember. So I don't know if you can see this, but created a little bit of a design that you may or may not cannot see with that. But here's another tip with scoring. If you take your knife and you set it flat to your surface so that it's perpendicular to your dough, and you slice it that way, what it's going to do is create this nice layering. So instead of cutting straight into your dough like this, tilting your blade at about this angle, at a very flat angle, and slicing it this way, it's going to create this nice layering effect with your dough. And if you've seen some beautiful looking doughs on Instagram that have this nice ear that every baker is going for, that's where that comes from, is creating that nice perpendicular cut into the dough. And I'll use my hand to show you that angle. So instead of a nice angle like that, like I was doing to mark up the dough, create a nice flat angle, and that'll create a nice ear for you. Really makes really beautiful doughs. So last step, we're there. We've made it. Our oven is preheated, and now we're just gonna throw it in the oven. So with some really thick gloves, make sure your towels or gloves are not wet in any way because your pots can be very hot. Take it out of the oven, place it in, cover it up, and drop the heat to 450 degrees. You're gonna bake it at half the time, at about 50 minutes is the total baking time, but it can go longer. 25 minutes covered at 450, 25 minutes uncovered at 450. That's a pretty simple approach that I take, but you can adjust. The basic principles when it comes to baking your bread is that you want ambient heat. You want direct heat. So the reason your oven is jacked up all the way to its highest temperature is so that everything inside can get nice and hot. So that when your bread goes in, and you drop the heat to 450, heaters turn off. And that mimics somewhat of the effect that a wood-fired oven would do. Bread bakers normally would bake bread after the oven fire was gone, and it just had residual heat. And that's how they prevented from burning bread from really high temperatures. So 450 covered, 450 uncovered, and let it go a little longer. Drop it down to 400 for another 10 minutes. You want to get a nice brown crust, some really good color on your bread, but you don't want to burn the bottom. So keep an eye on how much your oven is turning on. And that's also why you want to keep it a little bit high, about midway in your oven to higher up. That'll keep the bottom from burning. And that's it. I know it seems like a lot, but with practice, it really does become addictive, because you create something so delicious and healthy and of course it didn't turn out the way you wanted to. It won't. It still doesn't turn out that way for me. I still am chasing my perfect loaf 6 years later. But every time I have a delicious loaf of bread at the end that I can dive into. And there's nothing better than fresh bread. I swear. It is. Don't be surprised if it disappears in a day, because it's that good. That's it. Any questions at the end there, Sarah?
I think we have managed to stay relatively on top of them. We can open it up now if anyone wants to hop off mute, or if you have any lingering questions, to drop them in chat. Mary wants to know what oil is used for the parchment paper step.
Any oil.
So olive oil, vegetable oil.
Yeah, any oil will be fine. A higher burning point oil, like vegetable oil or sunflower seed oil, it keeps it from burning. But any oil will be fine.
Okay, and John says that he actually got to eat a rosemary loaf that you've made. At what point in the process would you add herbs?
Good question. I would add herbs when I add salt.
So kind of back at the beginning.
Yeah, back at the beginning. When you add the salt, or you're adding another flavor into your dough, do it when you add the salt. So that second turn, that second fold.
Okay, and just to make sure I haven't confused anyone, at what point is the point that you add the salt?
After the mix. So 30 minutes after you mix everything together. 30
Where you
minutes.
made that wet mix?
Yeah.
And you put it in the oven the first time with just the light on for 30 minutes. So it's not really dough yet, it's becoming dough.
Correct, yeah.
Okay. And Shannon asks, how do we order your bread? Shannon, thank you for asking. You can go to whollyschmidtsourdough.com, and I can also drop a link here. We have a bread subscription, or you can just request a one-off loaf. Thank you.
Great questions.
Wahoo wah. And if you have any other questions, like I said, we'll be following up with the link and the instructions, and we would love to connect with you all if you want to with us. It was great seeing you all.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to share something I love so deeply.
Thank you so much. It was awesome.